Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to give a presentation at this event. So my topic is going to be around the funding of long-term care for older people, focusing particularly on funding of care in England, but I'll make some mention to other countries as well. This has been a really controversial issue, as I'm sure everyone knows, with 25 years of debate about potential reforms, but no major change having yet been implemented, at least in England. So I'd like to just acknowledge the funding of much of the work I undertake is from the National Institute of Health and Care Research, and the usual disclaimer applies. So just to explain that by long-term care, one of the complications in talking about this an sort of international audience, and I understand we have participants overseas, is that definitions vary between countries, complicating issues, of course, for us who do quantitative work because we can't be sure that comparisons are accurate. So just to say that I'm talking here about the care and support that enables people to do everyday things that most of us take for granted. So it can cover social care as we describe it in England, and long-term health care, supported housing, and disability benefits. Though a lot of what I say is what is described in the England context as adult social care for older people. And I feel that on talking about the funding of long-term care, it would be, I think, even inappropriate, wrong perhaps, not to start by pointing out the obvious, that the vast majority of the costs fall on family unpaid carers. That's to say, not the cash costs, but the opportunity costs in people's time and the way it affects carers' lives more generally, and in some cases there may be cash costs as well, of course. So the latest census took place 2021, suggested that nearly 9% of the population of England provide unpaid care, mainly for family and friends, mainly in fact close relatives, with, as well known, of course, more women providing unpaid care than men, that around 1 in 6 of these carers are simultaneously caring for a relative who has care needs and a child at home, and nearly 1 in 2 are in employment, often part-time, but nevertheless in employment. And the Office for National Statistics' official estimate is that the value of this care was 57 billion in 2014, but much higher figures have also been quoted. So unpaid care, of course, intensive care is mainly provided by close family members, that in the projections work they were doing, which is very relevant for some of the projections for formal care that I'm about to move on to, we estimate that while unpaid care by spouses may well rise, there's a lot of uncertainty about unpaid care by daughters and sons. We've got studies looking at that, but that's, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into those, beyond saying that, of course, this is very relevant for the projections and the work we do on the funding of formal care services. So in terms of the numbers of people receiving long-term care, older people receiving long-term care in England, unfortunately there's a fair bit of uncertainty about the data. As I'm sure you know, there are probably about 350,000 older people receiving care in care homes, roughly half of them funded by the local authority or NHS, and roughly half funding their own care. But the data are somewhat uncertain. We're in the process of trying to get more updated data. And there are probably a similar number receiving care in the community, mainly in their own homes, therefore, but again, considerable uncertainty about the numbers. The funding of care in England is what can be described as sort of mixed economy of finance. So the monies are coming from a whole variety of different sources, complicating the system both for those who use in it and, of course, also for those who are responsible for policy making and for researching the topic. So I've already said that the majority of the costs, of course, fall on unpaid carers in terms of the value of the time which they devote to caring. So in England, a lot of the other costs fall on general taxation. We don't have a dedicated social insurance system in any part of the UK for social care, unlike, for example, Germany. So, as you know, the NHS is funded from general taxation, and so is a lot of the costs of adult social care, with other parts of the cost, public sector cost, falling on local taxation. The users of services, however, also bear a very considerable part of the cost, and that is where the debate and controversy lies. And I'll just say a little bit more about that in a minute. And of course, costs are also fall in terms partly of opportunity costs and time on volunteers working in this sector. So the means test, I will not go into the details. It is actually very complicated in all its details, but and I'm sure familiar to most people here. But basically, there's an upper limit on savings. If people have savings above that limit, they are ineligible for local authority support. And the value of someone's house is usually included in that figure of the savings if they enter a care home and if there's nobody else going to be living in their house anymore. And in addition to that, in terms of residential care, almost all the person's income also has to be contributed to the costs of care. And therein, as I say, lies a lot of the debate that's been taking place over the last 25 years. And we have been, the work that our colleagues and I have been involved in has been to provide analysis over that period, actually, to almost innumerable different proposals to reform this system. And some of the work I'm now going to present relates to the information, advice, evidence that we've been providing to policymakers to help them and inform them in consideration of the reforms, and also to provide evidence about the amounts of resources that will be required for long-term care in the future, and help feeding into government spending reviews and consideration of the sustainability of public expenditure. So for this purpose, we produce projections looking ahead usually 20 years of the numbers of older people who may require care. And also we look actually also the younger adult groups as well, particularly learning disabilities. We also, the public expenditure that will be required to meet the likely demand over the next 20 years, and the private expenditure that we would expect under the means test provisions, under the current system, and also under some of the proposed reforms to it. We've also looked at workforce as well, social care workforce. And I would say that the projections we produce are, of course, very sensitive to some of the assumptions we make, particularly, for example, on future mortality rates, future disability in old age, and also pay in the care sector, as well as other variables, including, as I've already mentioned, the availability of unpaid care by family in the future. So very briefly, the Office for National Statistics project a rise of just over 40% in the numbers of older people in England over that 20-year period. And they will be publishing updated projections post-COVID and post-census, possibly in January, though the date's been moving a bit. So we're going to be updating all of this. And to meet that, we estimate, based on rates of disability among the older population, that would mean that the numbers of older people with care needs would rise by about almost 50% over that same period. And I've already indicated, of course, these projections are sensitive to the assumptions on mortality and disability. So this is just to present the figures in chart form. The purple bars are for a sort of wide definition of disability, any limitation in activities of daily living, like feeding and dressing and so on, or indeed in shopping or other so-called instrumental activities. The orange bars are more severe disability. And linked to that, these are the projections that we produce for the numbers of people who we estimate would be needing or coming forward to receive long-term social care specifically over the next 20 years. And the sections of the bar indicate both the type of care, i.e. residential or community-based, and also who would pay for it, which is one of the issues that we're being asked to advise on. And in headline terms, what we are showing is that over time, in the residential care sector, it is likely that the proportion self-funding would rise, and hence their numbers would rise faster than the publicly funded, basically because of trends in home ownership in late old age. For the community settings, the opposite is true. It is likely that the numbers publicly funded would rise faster than the numbers privately funded because the costs of care are rising and likely to continue to rise faster than older people's incomes. So this, in a sense, is part of the picture that we're preparing for policymakers to inform their decisions on reforms to the system. So local authorities spend on adult social care pre-pandemic and was about 8.4 billion, and that post, in 20 years' time, we project that this will roughly double, forgetting about inflation, so double in constant prices, and that it will lead, even if we get economic growth on the lines that was at that time being projected, it would lead to the proportion of the economy's output going on publicly funded social care for older people to rise by about a half, from 0.45 to 0.65 of GDP. So this is to give a general picture of the rise, not just in the expenditure needed in cash terms, but is likely to rise as a proportion of the outputs of the economy. And that is one of our key findings, again, to inform decisions on the sustainability, really, of public funding for adult social care. So I'm now going to take a step back. Of course, as an economist, we're interested not just in the analysis, but also on the issues that lie behind considerations about how best to fund care for older people. And I found very interesting in this context is some comments by our late colleague, Sir John Hills, who referred to the 4 objectives of the welfare state as per this slide. And I suggest that all of them have a degree of relevance for adult social care, long-term care generally. Of course, it is insurance. I mean, the state is providing insurance against risks, and that applies to a lot of the welfare state, pensions and unemployment, and also, of course, long-term care. It also redistributes money from those with, towards those with greater needs and from those with lesser needs, but almost by definition, that is what we mean in sense by supporting people with care needs, that they're getting resources which are coming from taxation paid by the rest of the community. But the other 2 I'd also draw attention to. There's a degree of smoothing income across the life cycle. That is obvious for the state pension. Of course, people are contributing while they work, receiving when they're retired, but to many ways the same is true of long-term care. People are receiving, if eligible, in the latter years of their life, mainly. And stepping in where the family fails, well, it's more stepping in here where the family can no longer provide care themselves and the person needs publicly funded or privately funded formal care services. So a big issue here is managing risk. I've already pointed out that this is one of the objectives of the welfare state. How is this best done? Now, in many fields where there's a risk, no risk to our car or our home, we take out insurance, or maybe required to take out insurance. Risks then get pooled across the population, in effect. So if someone does have a burglary or fire or whatever in their home, they're not carrying the risk themselves. It's been shared out among all the policymakers. Unfortunately, this is, or maybe I shouldn't say unfortunately, but it's just a fact, this is very difficult to achieve for long-term care. The big insurers, as you may know, entered the market around the year 2000, I think, maybe a bit earlier, and pretty quickly left it again. So long-term care insurance does not exist in the UK, although it does in some other countries. That market failure is one of the traditional reasons for the state to become involved and provide, in effect, a form of social insurance, even if it's not called that. And that is usually, under most scenarios where people are risk averse, of course, an efficient way of proceeding, and raises the issue, well, why is there then a means test? Why isn't everyone being covered by that insurance? So that is part of the issue here on risk. Just to note that, of course, other countries have tackled this in all sorts of different ways. Some have social insurance, no means test, like in Germany. Some have a much more generous tax-funded system, like the Austria and I think most of the Scandinavian countries. Some have a mixture, like Japan and also Korea, which has more or less followed the Japanese system. Some do have some private insurance, including Israel. And we and the United States have what is described in the literature often as a safety net. So in a way, we're out on a limb together with the states in having this very strict means test. So that a lot of people, particularly in care homes, have to fund their own care, as has already been mentioned. And this balance, and what's displayed here, I think is again, in many ways, at the core of the debate over the last 25 years. So there are also other economic issues to consider. Of course, almost any funding system, or indeed organizational system, poses incentives, both for the local authority in this case, and for the individual and their families. And one of the pieces of advice, economic advice, that would be given to policymakers is to help think through what those incentives are. Now, one of the issues being raised in this country with the means test is where there's a disincentive to save, particularly if people can't save large amounts of money. Why save if you're going to have to use that money to pay for your care? If you don't save and don't have the money, the state will pay. So that's been one of the issues raised in this context. There are also other incentive issues here, and we've long had, here and in most countries, issues about whether there are slightly distortionary incentives between residential care and community-based care. I don't think I've got time really to go into that now, but that's also been part of the reason for past reforms in England. There are big issues in terms of equity, and I probably hardly need to say that, but clearly the way care is funded, and indeed also the eligibility criteria in terms of need, have equity implications. So, but the question is equity of what? Is it equity of inputs, so everybody with the same needs gets the same hours of care, let's say? Or is it equity of outputs? Everyone, or outcomes really, I should say, that everyone is given the opportunity to have the same quality of life, if you like, and that hours of care are tailored around that. That is important for the issue of whether, when the state provides care, it should take account or should not take account of the input by unpaid carers. And then there are issues about what inequities should we be concerned about, and the one relevant to the debate is particularly diagnosis. You may remember the Royal Commission years ago pointed out that people who have cancer are cared for by the NHS free of charge. People with dementia, has already been mentioned, of course, are relying to a very considerable extent on social care and may have to pay for it. I won't talk long about the sustainability of care. I know I'm running out of time, but that is, of course, one of the issues lying behind the analysis that we do, that policymakers, ministers want to know about the sustainability of different funding mechanisms in the future, and indeed about the current system, and we're advising and helping the Office for Budget Responsibility on that point. The funding reform I probably don't now have time to speak about. we've been doing quite a lot of work on the costs of it and of how it would affect different groups, income groups in the community, different people by housing tenure differentially. We published a paper on that last year, which, of course, the Department of Health and Social Care and the Treasury have with quite detailed analysis and is publicly available on our website. So basically some concluding points. I mean, again, I like to emphasize that the moment we talk about funding, I think we should say the majority of the costs, of course, fall on the family, as I think has been already discussed. That the funding mechanism in England is indeed very complicated and is controversial, remains, I think, controversial, and it's complicated, I think, for all concerned. And it would be even more complicated if the proposed reform that the government intends to implement in 2 years' time is in fact implemented. And to say that when we study as economists this issue, there are a whole lot of different sort of economic issues around sustainability and equity and incentives to be taken into account. But as a researcher, just to conclude, of course, I do feel that it's really important that policy should be informed by the evidence, and that is what we're trying to achieve. Thank you very much for your attention.